session 87, and we start a new chapter this week. We are looking at the 5th commandment. We are studying the Torah commandments. The two greatest is love Yahuwah and love your neighbor. Under Yahuwah, we have the first 5 commandments. We have discussed in detail the first 4, and now we are busy with the 5th one, which is honor your father and your mother. And under honoring father and mother, we have everything that's got to do with authority, everything that has to do with family, that has to do with the family life inside the camp. You know, how you love your neighbor, how you come under the authority of what your father and mother is teaching you about the laws of God. So we are discussing the various commandments that has to do with family and authority and living inside the camp with other believers, how to treat other believers and how to treat family. Because your fellow believer, your sister and your brother is your family at the end of the day, just as much as your blood family is. All right, so let's start with Leviticus 19, verse 17 and 18. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall in any wise rebuke your neighbor, and not suffer sin upon him. You shall not avenge, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahuwah, your Elohim. So let's look at this verse in detail, because there's quite a lot that is said in this one verse, or in these 2 verses. Remember how we said, we looked at Yeshua said the 2 greatest commandments is love Yahuwah and love your neighbor as yourself. And here we have Leviticus 19 verse 18 that explains to us to love your neighbor as yourself. So everything that Yeshua has ever talked about is always to be found in the Old Testament in his Father's words. So Leviticus 19 verse 17 is the verse that's before the very important verse 18. And these 2 verses together actually gives you a lot of information on what it means to love your neighbor. Because it says in verse 17, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. And that's very important, because you remember when Yeshua said, even if you hate your brother in your heart, you have transgressed the Torah. Just to look like you love people and you don't murder them, but you actually have secret grudges and bitterness inside of your heart, and you don't like your neighbor. I mean, we all go through that every single day. There's not a day that goes past that you meet somebody that you don't like. But to hate your brother, your fellow believer, Moses was here teaching the commandments of God to the people of Israel. And they had to live together in the wilderness for 40 years. So imagine for yourself, if you have to live with somebody and he does something against you and you hate him in your heart, but you don't tell him that you hate him because, you live together in the camp. And you can't tell other people that you actually hate him, but you bear that hatred in your heart. It's going to finally, at the end of the day, make your heart dark and start making you depressed and start making you angry and revengeful towards that person. So that's, Moses is teaching it here in the Old Testament, Yeshua is teaching it in the New Testament. You cannot hate somebody in your heart, because it's the same as hating somebody in the physical life. If you walk around and say, I hate you, that's actually better than keeping a secret hatred inside your heart, isn't it? Because Yeshua says, and Paul confirms, that hypocrisy is actually a very bad sin. It's worse to be a hypocrite and to hide hatred and contempt and that kind of things in your heart than if you live it out and people can see who you are and how you feel. Because it's better, you know that saying that says what you see is what you get. Most people today, they put up a front. You look at their face and everything seems fine, but if we can see each other's hearts like God can see our hearts, I think it will be quite frightening to see the amount of hatred and unforgiveness and bitterness and contempt for people in people's hearts. So our God, under the first most important commandment of love, Yahuwah with all your heart. Under this subdivision of family and camp living and parents and authority, God says in His authority, this is how you treat your brother and your sister. The last 5 commandments explain to us in detail what that looks like. You can't murder, you can't do this, you can't do that. So then it becomes a lot of detail. But just listen to the summary of all of this. You cannot hate your brother in your heart. You shall in any wise rebuke your neighbor, and don't suffer sin upon him. So when you see your neighbor or your brother, in this instance, brother and neighbor is used in the same sentence. So it means the same thing. It's like Yeshua explained when they asked him, who is my neighbor? I must love my neighbor as myself. Who's my neighbor? And Yeshua explained, basically, the person to whom you are a neighbor, that is your neighbor. Because the Good Samaritan walked along the road, and the Levites and the priests didn't want to help the guy that was attacked by robbers. But the Samaritan came, and he became a neighbor to the guy that was attacked. And therefore Yeshua explained by that parable who you become a neighbor to, who you are a brother to. That is your neighbor and your brother. And in this instance, whether we say neighbor or brother, we can see it's got to do with living inside the camp. These laws were given to Israel, the people of God. And He says, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. And if you see your neighbor sin, rebuke him. So if you can see your brother, or if he is your neighbor or your physical brother or just your brother in faith, it doesn't matter. If you can see that maybe he's got some hate in his heart, God says, don't suffer, don't allow the sin upon him. Rebuke him, help him. And as the New Testament says, you go to your brother, and if he doesn't listen to you, you take 2 or 3 fellow brothers with, and you try and help them, and you don't rebuke them in public and put shame on them. You try and help them as your brother. You love your neighbor as you love yourself. You would not like to be rebuked in public before people and be embarrassed, and therefore you cannot do that to somebody else, because you need to love your neighbor as you love yourself. How you want yourself to be treated, that's how you treat your brother. So if you can see your neighbor or your brother is suffering from hatred in their heart towards somebody that hurt them, show them the way that forgiveness is not about the other person deserving it or asking for it, or it's got nothing to do with the other person. It's got to do with cleansing your own heart and getting the bitterness and the hatred inside of you, getting that out, and you living a holy life, not the other person. So help your neighbor. Don't suffer sin upon him. And then verse 18, you shall not avenge, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people. So we know that the rest of the Bible says, God himself says, I will revenge you. I will eventually kill all your enemies. I will bring them down that has trampled upon you. Revenge belongs to Yahuwah. So we are not to take revenge. We are to forgive, live righteously, don't allow unrighteousness. But don't bear grudges, personal grudges inside of you. It's just going to kill you. It's going to make you angry and depressed and not seeing the sunlight anymore, but only seeing the dark clouds. I mean, it's bad for your health. So God doesn't want you to think about revenge, and He doesn't want you to bear a grudge in your heart. It's like swallowing poison and you hope the other person dies. You are swallowing the poison. You are bearing that rock inside of you that is making your heart heavy. That is what a grudge is. It's like a heavy rock inside of you. So God says, leave revenge to me. If I was a God of revenge, everything that you have done against me would have come upon your own head. But as I promised from Genesis 3, I will bring you out from under the judgment that is upon you for everything you've done wrong against me. And through my atonement that I've made available through the manifestation of my word in the flesh, I can now forgive you your sins. So who are you, human being, not to forgive somebody else? Instead of bearing a grudge, just forgive them and let them go. And if they become a brother because of the way that you treat them, well done. You've won another soul for the kingdom. But if they don't come to repentance and they don't ever ask your forgiveness, they're definitely not going to ask Yahuwah's forgiveness either. And then Yahuwah will deal with them. He will judge each one according to their works. You need to look into the future and understand that that person, whatever he has done, will come upon his head. When Yeshua comes, he comes with his reward in his hand, to reward everyone according to their works and to judge them according to their works. So leave the revenge and the righteousness to Yahuwah. And you, by forgiving, even if you don't even tell that person, because sometimes if you forgive somebody and you go to them and you say, oh, you know what you did to me 2 years ago, I have forgiven you. Then that person, I've experienced it, and most of you have experienced it. Then that person would say, what? I didn't do anything wrong against you. Why do you have to forgive me? You have to ask me for forgiveness. So when you forgive somebody, you know what, you don't even tell them. You don't even tell them because people are so arrogant and people never want to admit responsibility for what they've done. And if you come to them and tell them that you've forgiven them and that you don't bear any grudges anymore against them, then they'll actually act surprised and wonder, what have I done? So it's not about them, it's about your relationship with God and leaving whatever judgment is fair for that person, leaving that to God. You don't bear the grudge and you don't avenge yourself. You don't try to force the law on anyone. I've learned that over the years with very, very hard lessons. Because God says, don't avenge, don't grudge, because you must love your neighbor as yourself. And you wouldn't like it that somebody would walk around with hatred for you in their hearts. So this is such an important lesson for us to learn. And God ends this verse by saying, I am Yahuwah. So you need to love your neighbor as yourself. And if you think you don't have to, I'm just reminding you, I am your God. I am the Almighty One. You need to listen and obey me. And I'm telling you, don't avenge, don't bear a grudge, and love your neighbor as yourself. Beautiful. So I just want to jump to Deuteronomy 10 verse 9, because that is also a commandment that works beautifully together with these ones about your neighbor. Deuteronomy 10 verse 9. Sorry, it's verse 19. Love you therefore the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So this has got to do with, again, your brother and your neighbor. Just think back. The Egyptians that came out of Egypt with Israel, did they really remain strangers all the way through the wilderness journey, all the way into the promised land? Or were they eventually adopted into the family of God and they became part of Israel? So the people that were living with Israel in the wilderness, they were all opgedeel. They were all put into certain of the tribes and they became part of Israel. They became the neighbor and the brother. But then the Bible also talks about strangers. Remember when Ruth was taken up into Judah, into Israel, and she said, your God is now my God and your people is now my people. When she married Boaz and she became the great-great-grandmother of King David, she wasn't called a stranger all her life because she came from Moab and she was a pagan, but now she repented and she lived under the law of Yahuwah. But she wasn't called a stranger the rest of her life. And so we can see many examples in the Bible. Everybody from any tribe, nation, and tongue that joins themselves to Yahuwah will get a name better than that of sons and daughters, and God makes them pillars in His house. So those people from other nations that comes back to the olive tree and is grafted back into the olive tree, those are not called strangers. Those are brothers. Those are neighbors. So when the Torah talks about strangers, it's not just easy to say, oh, it's the Egyptians that came back. No, the strangers were people even along the road, even in the wilderness, that started joining Israel. And a lot of these strangers were also used as servants eventually, but they also intermarried because they became part of the faith in the one true God. And faith in this God makes you clean and makes you part of Israel. And then you can marry like Ruth did, like Rahab from Jericho, like she did. And you start marrying inside Israel, and you are part of Israel. So God says, love your neighbor as yourself. Treat your neighbor right, treat your brother right. But he also confirms, even those who are not yet your brothers, also treat them right. Love them just as much as you love your brother. He says, love you, therefore, the stranger, because you must remember that you were strangers in Egypt. Do you remember how bad it was for you when you were tortured, and when you weren't happy and you weren't in your homeland? You were under a strange king in a strange land with strange people, and you were longing home. And just think about that's how strangers are feeling as well. And treat them well. Love them as you love your neighbor, as you love yourself. Absolutely beautiful. Yahweh also don't want us to oppress the strangers. Even if the strangers become your servant, because a lot of the strangers were eventually taken up as servants into Israel. But the way that you treat a stranger is, somebody has once said, the proof of somebody's character is how you treat a waiter or a waitress. So a lot of people will go into restaurants, and if the waiter doesn't serve them the way that they like, they would, be rude to them. But God looks into your heart. The way that you treat a servant and a stranger and somebody that is lower than you, that is a proof of your character. If you only treat people well, like Yeshua told a parable in the New Testament, if somebody comes to a wedding and he's nicely dressed and he's got a ring on his finger, and you give him the best seat in the house, and somebody else comes in with dirty old clothes, and you tell him, oh, you can come sit here by my feet, because servants were always told to sit by their master's feet. So Yeshua said, if that is what you do, then you're a hypocrite. Because the guy that is rich, you give him the best place, and the guy that's poor, you give him the worst place. But isn't everybody the same in the eyes of Yahuwah? So the Torah teaches us to treat everybody the same, not to treat servants or strangers or people that are poor and that's lowly. Do not treat them any different than you treat your own brother and sister. Because we need to love both our brother and sister, our neighbor and the stranger. We've looked at all these verses. You can see this golden thread through all of God's commandments, teaching us a much different life than what this world is teaching us. So Exodus 22 verse 21, you shall not vex a stranger. You shall not oppress him, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So again, if there's a stranger or a servant, you mustn't make his life hard just because he's a stranger. Don't treat him any different than you treat your own brother. All right, the next very important lesson that we need to learn, it's not only about how you treat your neighbor or your brother or your sister physically, where everybody can see, but also there where people can't see. There where it's maybe only yourself, like we looked, if you hate somebody in your heart, God can see there. But the very very important factor as well is gossiping, because gossiping, most people think, is not really a sin. I mean, you are not doing anything wrong, you are not harming anybody, but yet there where you are gossiping about somebody in the secret, God hears that, and that is still a sin against your brother, your neighbor, and the stranger. Because at the end of the day, when you gossip, you speak softly, and if that person that you are gossiping about suddenly walks into the room, you will keep quiet, Because if you say, I'm not gossiping, I'm just telling the truth about the person, then you must be able to tell the truth to that person's face. Or if you say, I'm not gossiping about the person, but the moment he walks in, you keep quiet, then that's a sign that you have gossiped about him. And God says in Leviticus 19 verse 16, you shall not go up and down as a tale-bearer among your people. Neither shall you stand against the blood of your neighbor. I am Yahuwah your Elohim. Beautiful. He puts two things in the same verse. He says, you must not gossip. You cannot go up and down telling stories, being a tale bearer, telling all sorts of tales and stories about some other people. But in the same sentence, he says, neither shall you stand against the blood of your neighbor. The blood of your neighbor is your neighbor's family. So when you stand against them, it is like being at war with them. And that's definitely the opposite of loving them. So he puts that in the same sentence as being a talebearer among your own people. Because if you can walk up and down bearing tales, telling stories, gossiping, then it's like you are at war against your neighbor and against the people that you are gossiping about. So it's quite a serious matter, not to gossip about others. So we are not to gossip, we are not to take revenge, we are not to bear a grudge, we cannot oppress the stranger, we cannot embarrass any people, we must reprove a neighbor who sins, we mustn't hate any of our neighbors, we must show love towards our neighbors and towards strangers. So let's look at Leviticus 19 verse 32. Come now. You shall rise up before a grey head and honor the face of an old man, and you must fear your God. I am your God. So Leviticus 19 verse 32 is beautiful. It teaches us to honor the wise old people, the people that are aged, people that are old, that has got grey hair. We must honor the face of an old man, because God says, when you do that, you actually fear me. He says, you shall rise up before the hoary head. So that means when the grey-haired person walks into the room, you must actually rise up out of respect and honor for him. And God says, so you rise up and you honor the face of the old man, and you must fear me. I am your God. So if you don't honor the old people, then you are not fearing God. Because doesn't the Bible say that God is the Ancient of Days? Doesn't the Bible explain God has white hair? And Yeshua is explained in the New Testament, in Revelation, as the one with white hair. Not that he's old, but it's got to do with respect towards the people that has been around for much longer than you, that are wiser than you. And there's nobody else that has been around longer than any of us, than Yahuwah himself. So if you say you honor Yahuwah, but you can't honor any old people, even if it's doesn't matter what color person it is, if it's another race than your own race, or if it's an old boemelaar, what is boemelaar now in English? When somebody is begging, even if it's a beggar, if it's an old man begging next to the road, can you imagine most people, most people just treat those people very badly. But if you ever encounter an old beggar, treat him with respect, because God says, I am your God. And if you fear me, you treat an old man with respect. You stand up before him and you honor the face of an old man. And within the tribes of Israel, the old people, the old men, were also the people that knew the Torah and that knew the history, everything that happened to Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. And these old men were the ones who were telling the stories to their children around the fire every night. So to fear God and to respect old people also means that you get the opportunity to learn from them, to learn about Adam and Cain and Abel and Abram, Isaac and Jacob and everything that happened before, because they are the ones that nostalgically tell these old, beautiful, ancient stories, and they bring out the lessons that there are for the younger people in that. So we treat the older people with honor, because they are wiser than us. They're more clever than us anyway. And even if they're not clever, we treat them with respect because they represent authority. We are busy looking at authority, and they are absolutely the ones in authority inside our camps. So we treat them with respect. We listen to their old stories. We go and visit old age homes if you have time to do such things and listen to their stories. You can sometimes learn so much from that. It's quite beautiful. So all these Torah commandments, although the church teaches that we are free from the Torah, we can see how these Torah commandments are not strange. They're not peculiar. They cannot be just for Jews. Is it only Jewish people that treat old people with respect? No, I mean, that's ridiculous. Every tribe, nation and tongue on this world, whether you're Christian or Muslim or Jew or Hebrew, you must treat old people with respect. But especially those people who fear God and who calls Yahuwah their Elohim. If they don't keep the commandments, which are all natural, I mean, these are natural commandments. You don't embarrass people. You don't gossip about people. You don't bear grudges against people. These are all beautiful and natural commandments for anybody to follow, but especially for those who say they fear God, and especially for those who say they follow Jesus. How can you say you are free from these laws? These laws are beautiful and amazing and teaches you the right way to live.